one around, that's fine. But for me, as long as it's not,
Yeah, which you would need.
as long as I'm
We had
seeing
one
what
or
show
two
you.
spots there. But one thing was that we were actually at a lot of museum, you know, so the
What's in the house?
No, no, no.
and there's this car and
Just affect me.
You are very loud.
You should switch off your sound.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to UCT. For those of you if it's your first time, my name is Professor Zweletshu Jolobe, and I'm your host. And I'm also the head of the Department of Politics, which is a co-host for this event and is also a partner. It's my pleasure to open the first policy brief seminar at here, where we really want to aim to provide some insights on maybe one of the most elusive dimensions of our time, which is peace. And most importantly, how to silence the guns and how to create a new world order that's characterized by mutual respect, global equity, and global cooperation. So our journey today begins with Ukraine, and we deal with important questions about how to get to peace in that country. And we really are concerned with three main issues, I think. And the first one, for me at least, is what lessons can we learn from that conflict? That's the first one. Two, what questions or issues does it raise regarding how we think about multilateralism, issues around sovereignty, UN reform, and what the emergent global order is beginning to look like? And most importantly, is the United Nations system still appropriate? And how does this relate to how we think about the issues that arise by that conflict? And so we have some very good people who are here, who will help us unpack these and more issues and questions. Since we are a bit behind time, I think that we should maybe break the second section at about 10 to 11, I think. And we should maybe have our break or our tea at 11:30. Zwinka, over to you.
Thanks a lot, everybody. So maybe a little bit about this initiative. This is an initiative by four different organizations. Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation, Ukrainian Association of South Africa, as well as Democratic Initiatives Foundation. And those organizations put a platform together for experts from different institutions in Ukraine and in South Africa, and in the future from other African countries, to collaborate on finding the solutions not only for peace in Ukraine, but also for preventing similar conflicts on the continent. As you know, in June 2023, 7 leaders of African countries took a strong stand and went on a mission, on a peace mission to Ukraine and to Russia to help with finding a peaceful solution. This is the first mission of African leaders outside of the continent that addresses an issue outside of the continent, and it's testifying the importance of finding peaceful solution for African countries. So our experts worked on 3 different topics that include regional security architecture, nuclear safety, and forceful deportation of children. All those 3 topics are critical for both African continent and Ukraine, and our experts will elaborate in more details about this. But there is no doubt that the scale of this war is unprecedented, as there are hundreds of thousands of people involved in this military conflict. And this is also the first time that the country with nuclear weapon is attacking a country that gave up nuclear weapon, which also puts additional challenge for non-proliferation and disarmament movement, and sets significant challenges for achieving sustainable development goals in the future. So I would like to thank all our partners, and would like to pass on the microphone to Dr. Yakovlev from Kyiv Mohyla Academy.
Okay. Thank you, Zinka. Thank you, those who came, and thank you those who are watching. And of course, great thanks to Professor Zwelutu, and thanks for hosting us and giving the opportunity to speak. I have to say this is my first trip to Africa at all, and I'm glad it started with Cape Town and your wonderful university. I'm glad to be here. So also apologies, I'm going to look into my phone because I have the text on my screen, and the main logic for it is like when you travel abroad and you take a long trip from Ukraine to South Africa, you appreciate every single gram of printed material and you don't want to waste paper on that. Anyway, so I do have my time now to briefly tell you about the main ideas from our document, which is now in the process. We're finishing it, but the idea of regional security and a couple of things that I would like to highlight from the document. So to begin with, I would like to say that, of course, you can always say that we Ukrainians are biased towards Russia because Russia invaded us, and we are traveling around the globe to get for more support, to get different countries to support us. But I would like to draw away from that position and say that now we have a great window of opportunity, because the war in Ukraine, of course, is a bloody war. It's unprecedented invasion by Russia. But what we have to look at is that now we have a window of opportunity to reform the world security architecture, which basically is crumbling. My colleagues yesterday used a very good metaphor, which is dying basically and not functionable. Because as we see, the architecture of international organization, which is heavily criticized, needs to be reformed in a couple of ways. So one thing is that we now have an opportunity to reform the United Nations Security Council, and that is also a great big deal for African continent. As we look at different ways this organization functions, we can see that the General Assembly, when doing any resolution on voting on things like aggression or invasion or stuff like that, we see that there is almost unanimous decision to that these things are not acceptable, especially with a country, as Dvinka mentioned, with nuclear weapons, invades its neighbor because it believes that its neighbor is not a country in itself, because we can all watch and rewatch Mr. Putin's interview to Tucker Carlson, where he spent a lot of time and great deal of time explaining why we Ukrainians do not exist. And then he decided to invade us because we're non-existent as a nation, in his view. But the idea that we need to reform and change the security architecture is not the problem with General Assembly, but mostly with the United Nations Security Council. Everybody, as a scholar of political science and international relations, we all know that we now kind of have to live, or we have to be squeezed into the framework of security architecture, which is a legacy of the Second World War. But at the very moment the United Nations was founded, and the world already back then was not as it used to be before. The great imperial powers of Europe were already crumbling. And my students, especially younger generation, they ask these questions. How come not a single African country is a permanent member of the Security Council? How come not a single Asian and Southeast country is there? Even though we know that big countries play an important role in the world politics, but they are not there. And great powers there can veto any decision. And I think this is exemplary that Russia blocks the decision of the Security Council, because the meaning, the symbolism of being on the Security Council is to provide for more security. But when a country which actually violates international world order and decides to invade a neighboring country sits there, it is an indicator, and also can veto any decision. It is an indicator there's something wrong with its system. Now, second thing, why is that we Ukrainians are interested in having more countries in the Security Council? Is that because we Ukrainians believe once we have, for example, South Africa there, you would definitely support us? It is not about that if we have more countries there, we Ukrainians might feel more support. The idea behind it is that if this organization or this structure, like General Assembly, is more diverse, has more voices from different continents, and these voices can also bring their own concerns for regional security in different contexts on different continents. We Ukrainians, and not only we, but all around the world, with a more diverse organization, with more countries there, I think there would be more opportunities to have a more secure and peaceful coexistence, or even of different systems, or different traditions and things. So it is extremely important, and I'm also advocating for this diversity in this highly important national organization, because it can also bring more trust. So to tell you a funny story, last year I published my first non-fiction book, which is called Conspiracy Theories, How Not to Become a Conspiracist. It deals with conspiracies, conspirological worldview. I know all this stuff. And one of the example, because this book is in Ukrainian for the Ukrainian audience, of course, and one of the example is that there is a conspiracy in the United States which says that United Nations is taking over the United States to rule the states and the world. This conspiracy makes every single person in Ukraine laugh because we don't see that the United Nations is so powerful because it cannot prevent wars, it cannot stop genocides around the globe, and its Security Council is basically non-functioning because there are countries that can veto and block any decision. So it is very wrong and something needs to be done about that. Again, with this diversity in Security Council, an opportunity to have more countries with their voices would also bring us Ukrainians an opportunity to be heard. This example of Russia annexing our territories, and just to give you this example, when Russia claims that the territories it annexed is part of Russia because there was a referendum, from the day of invasion to the decision to change the constitution to include these territories, it took 9 days. I think it is the swiftest way you can have it, from the day of invasion to have all the invasion, then announcing the referendum, and then making all the changes to the constitution. Imagine how fast that could go and what kind of referendum there might be. Imagine anyone, okay, and of course if you take pictures, you can look at the internet with military people with the guns walking on the streets with this funny box where you can cast your ballot. It is an example that this is not a referendum, this is not the will of the people. And I repeat this, if we could have a more diverse international security organizations where different countries had also their voice, their say, they bring their expertise, their problems and concerns, there would be a place for a fairer society and a fairer international community, which is very important to stress. Okay, so and yesterday I also thought about this idea of how we define regions and redefine regions, because we in Ukraine did not realize how important we were. For example, average Ukrainian did not reflect that we were also important because of our grain and fertilizer export for the African continent. We realized that after the invasion. Of course, we know in Ukraine that we had a very developed and still have a very developed agriculture, but we did not reflect upon how important this global change. So regions now are transnational and global, so there are more connection to that. And to give you an example of where we have something to reflect upon together is the role of the South Africa in non-proliferation, especially in terms of nuclear weapons, of course, because Russia now violated this principle by having its nukes in Belarus, a country it's practically occupied. And then this blackmailing the world with my colleague Olena is going to speak about the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe occupied by the Russian military. So the examples of creating world as a more secure place and the role South Africa played in it, and like all this non-proliferation stories was developed. We have this experience that can be compared, studied, and when different regions, different countries, for example, East Europe, because Eastern Europe we have our own problems compared to Western Europe, and we have something really to reflect upon then. With this redefining the regional cooperation and regional security when learning from different experiences can also be a way forward with this. In our document, there's a whole section called multilateralism. I think that multilateralism really starts when, not only when great powers cooperate with each other, but when countries from Eastern Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia do find common ground to reflect upon the experience which is comparable to find solution to create world a more safer space as such. I think I can stop there and then give the word to my colleague.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maxim. Thank you also, Prof. Zweli, for hosting us, and Zvika for the partnership with the Ukraine Society of South Africa. So I'm Tim Murithi with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation here in Cape Town, and I commend this initiative that is going to lead to the publication of a number of policy briefs on these topics that we're discussing today. So I think what is clear is that no one should have their rights infringed upon. As human beings, we do have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering from the loss of their freedom. And in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are multiple contested narratives. There are some false narratives, political spin doctoring going on. So I think it is your responsibility as an individual to keep yourself informed about what is transpiring in that region and to act, to make a decision to act in any small way that you can. So I'll also focus on the issue of regional security. And Africa, we're quite familiar with the colonial conquest, the scramble for Africa, 1884, 85, and the occupation of our continent by European colonial powers. Then I'll look at the UN Charter and where we are in terms of the crisis of multilateralism that Prof. Zweli has mentioned, and maybe suggest some ways forward in terms of how we can transform our international system, particularly of collective security embodied in the UN Security Council. So I think Africa, it's clear we have endured the brutality of colonialism, the conquest and dominion and oppression. And our countries really only began to be free in the 1960s. And Zimbabwe was in the 1980s, South Africa in 94. And that's 30 years that's passed, but we're still dealing with the legacy of internal colonialism, land dispossession, and you can see the signs of this all around us, in fact, across South Africa. So we're very familiar with wars of colonial conquest. And I think as Africans, this should, enable us to even connect or at least understand the context that is playing out in Ukraine. And I believe that despite the multiple narratives, the selective narratives, and the false narrative, even fake news, that is happening at the moment, we have to inform ourselves and also recognize that Ukraine was an independent state in 1945 when the United Nations was established. Many African freedom fighters, including South African freedom fighters, were trained in Ukraine, in Odessa, and in other parts of the country. As part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine supported many freedom movements on the African continent. But it's also true that the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the flooding of weapons across the African continent, and some of them did, in fact, come from Ukraine and other states in the region. But I think the point I'm trying to make is you need to keep yourself informed about this historical context to push back against the false narratives that are being spread out there. But what we have now, we've seen when the Russian invasion began on the 24th of February 2022, Russia was sitting as the president of the United Nations Security Council, and it was invading a fellow member state of the United Nations system. If you need a metaphor or a sign that the international system of collective security is broken, there you have it. And I would actually say that the system is functionally dead. The UN Security Council is a living dead organism. It doesn't really achieve very much. And it has become suffocated by the actions of powerful countries who are indiscriminately using the veto power to pursue their own selfish interests. And the system also excludes a majority of the world's population from international decision making. I think the members of the Permanent Five, US, France, UK, China, and Russia, constitutes about 1/3 of the world's population. So you've got 2/3 of the world's population really at the mercy of very hostile powers and forces. And it's time to rethink, I would argue, and remake the global order. Now, this does not mean throwing the UN baby out with the bathwater, but it does imagine reimagining multilateralism, redesigning institutions to create a more effective and inclusive global system of collective security. From an African perspective, this is an urgent task for us. More than 60% of the agenda of the UN Security Council focuses on the African continent. And yet no single African country has a permanent seat or permanent membership of the UN Security Council. And so in effect, we see a situation of injustice where African countries can only participate in deliberations and negotiations about their own future as spectators and bystanders. So the multilateral system, from an African perspective, is equally unfair, unjust, illegitimate, and the Security Council really has to be transformed. If you add this, the historical context of African countries barely being present in the formation of the United Nations in 1945, April to June, only 3 African countries were independent. Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa was still under the yoke of apartheid, and so wasn't technically independent. And the small number of African countries present at the formation of the United Nations also gives us a strong case to push for the transformation of the United Nations system. So we have a crisis of multilateralism, but we do also have a window of opportunity. This year is the United Nations Summit of the Future, very grandiose in typical United Nations grandiosity. There is a Pact of the Future that has already been issued, and it's been published, and you can download it and read it. Now, this Pact of the Future is not offering anything new. The Pact of the Future uses the word reaffirm 49 times. So the United Nations is very keen to reaffirm and so on and so forth. And the reason for this, it's an intergovernmental negotiation, and that document has been developed by the governments, the 193 governments, not the people. And I think we as the people have to find ways to insert ourselves into this process. And so this is it's a very opportune year for us to push the agenda of thinking outside the box, beyond the platitudes and the promises that the Summit of the Future proposes. It's not going to live up to the hype if we take the Pact of the Future as a guiding light. So the UN Charter has a provision within it which a lot of people are not familiar with, and I would encourage you to go and do some of your own research and look at Article 109 of the United Nations Charter, specifically paragraph 3, which speaks of the need for a general conference to review the United Nations Charter. This has been in that document since the founding of the UN, but in the 79-year history of the organization, the UN Charter has never been reviewed. There was an attempt in 1955, but it was sabotaged. So this is still on the cards, it's still something that can be done. There's a draft resolution that can be put on the table, and I think Ukraine, working collectively with African governments, can actually be part of the leading group of countries that put such a resolution on the table. President Zelensky of Ukraine has actually stated quite openly that he is very keen to see a transformation of the international system based on what happened. So we do have an opportunity here to work as researchers, those who are engaging policymakers, those who are working with international institutions to actually push this agenda. And I think this is the time to do it, because the window begins to close the more we move forward into time. So this global crisis of multilateralism, the collapse of the international system of collective security, is a massive gap. And if we don't find ways to plug that hole, at least to visualize and vision what the future looks like, then I think we're going to struggle moving forward. I think very briefly on the African peace mission, it was for South Africa, a moment of stepping out and leading an initiative to St. Petersburg and Kiev. And it is placing South Africa on the international stage. We need to, as Africans, also analyze that much more deeply. And the reason I think it's important is that it does create a track if and when the opportunity presents itself. And this probably means without Putin in Moscow, there could be an opening there to move towards a more focused peacemaking process. Just to put that on the table, that is not a wasted initiative, and we need to keep looking into that and analyzing that initiative. So I think I'll stop there, and looking forward to the discussions and the questions and the comments later on. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Before I open things up, there are a number of points I think that we can maybe structure our discussion around. And the one thing that for me keeps coming up is this idea of a new security architecture, right? And this sort of brings me back to kind of 2 points, I think. And the first one is that, you know, how does this window of opportunity look like? Because if I think about global politics since the end of the Cold War, right, and the end of the Cold War pretty much ends the post-World War II consensus, because the entire Eastern Europe pretty much falls apart. USSR falls apart, and we have a new kind of post-World War II world order where there were expectations of peace, that's true, and if we think about even moments like the end of apartheid, one could argue that it probably was that moment where you had the most favorable conditions for people to think about peace. But then the Iraq War changes that. And the Iraq War sort of opens up a very dangerous precedent where, once again, a member of the UNSC invades another country. And I think that world politics moves from the politics of regime change brought about by Iraq and Afghanistan to the annexation of Crimea in, 2014. And there was no consequence for Russia for annexing Crimea, right? And so I think that it seems like we're moving towards less, or a kind of realist international system. And I'm just quite curious about how then do we, or what does this new architecture look like? That's the first thing. And two, and this is linked, I think, to maybe how we think about the Ukraine war, what does peace look like? Right? And because the first thing I always think of when people talk about UN reform and all these things, that it's going to require the very people responsible for regime change and annexation to agree on it. And that's the US and Russia. China more is a, benevolent player, but I think that both those three countries, I'm not sure whether they would have the interest of it. And I'm curious, how does that look like? The second thing, and this is my issue now, that I think it always sort of like a bugbear I have, is that to what extent do we account for domestic politics in Russia as a precondition for change? Because if I think about, the internal dynamics there, is that you have a group of people who all look quite old, 72, 75 plus, etc., and who don't seem to like to or want to leave. And we all know how that movie ends. It never ends well. And so to what extent do we factor those things in terms of what's going on in there, in how we think about the future? Because I can't believe that everybody supports the war in the way in which it is portrayed to us. And then maybe the final thing is, and I think that this maybe is where the kind of African Peace Mission comes in, and the broader implications of it is that, BRICS has just enlarged now. And I'm not sure that, and this I know is in the media a lot, but I'm not sure that the government in this country supports the Russian Federation in the way in which it is portrayed. Not very convinced by that. And maybe, yes, in public, they might want to present a certain image of it. But it looks to me that the issue is that they are heavily, heavily resistant to BRICS having a security dimension, which is what the Russians want. And so I'm curious how, how maybe from a Ukrainian perspective, and I think that the position in this country is, and I think that you're quite right, Tim, Ukraine was also part of the USSR. Many comrades here were trained in Odessa, so we can't say that the support for Russia is because of them, because I'm like, well then, Ukraine too was part of that. And I'm just curious about how one factors in these things, right? But I think that for now, let's maybe open things up and questions, comments, etc. Yes, thanks.
I can comment on what you said. Thank you very much. I noted all these things, but by Professor Zvelutu, and just a couple of brief answers. Brief because it's huge. But I now see topics for maybe a joint article or something, discussion. It's very interesting. First, your examples of United States invading other countries and Russia invading Ukraine now are rightful in that I think if we all ask the question, what should the architecture of security in the future look like, is that any aggression or violent act against a sovereign nation, an invasion of it, should not be left unpunished. There must be a mechanism how we deal with it, how we discuss the reasons for, not only the reasons for invasion, because, if you listen to what I mentioned, Tucker Carlson interview of Putin, is basically you can also explain why it was important, but any act of aggression like that should be taken into consideration seriously, and then we can think about the ways to punish, restrict, and do something like that. There have to be mechanisms how to deal with things like that. And I repeat now why it's important, because a nuclear power like Russia invaded its neighboring country because it questions the status of the nation, if it exists. So I think if that goes unpunished, there are many publications now what China would do next, how it would impose its rule in Asia around these countries, violate the rights of neighboring nations, things like that. So the first component, there should be a platform, a way to punish any aggression, and there should be some action taken. But how to do that is open for discussion, of course, and even the reform of the Security Council, the different ways to abolish the veto power, to have the qualified majority, but then to have some sort of possibility even to act against aggression. This is important. It's very good that you brought about that. So answer that question: mechanisms, aggression against sovereign nation, and invasion, stuff like that. If it goes unpunished, then it continues basically. And of course, not annexation of Crimea, but before that, the Russian invasion into Georgia. Which is now called Sakartvelo official in the Caucasus, this was also left unpunished, basically, with a limited number of sanctions. So policies of regime change, I'm very happy that you brought this idea about what should happen domestically with Russia. In Ukraine, because we Ukrainians were colonized by Russians, and again, I refer to this Putin's interview, because I'm happy that this interview exists, because explaining from the 9th century how Vikings came to Novgorod is not an explanation to invade your neighboring country. I mean, this is insane. But the idea is that Ukrainians never existed as a nation. They were invented either by Austria-Hungary or Lenin created Ukraine. And you mentioned Odessa. I gave this lecture for Indonesian students online last week. I showed them a passport by Ukrainian People Republic issued to a doctor from Odessa who traveled internationally with that passport. It was 1918. So Ukrainian People's Republic was already there, and the person was from Odessa, and this is part of Ukraine. So just very symbolic. But anyway, regarding Russia, why we Ukrainians sympathize with all the nations that are conquered, colonized, and oppressed by Russia. So, to give you an example, this Buryat. Many Ukrainians did not know about that. Buryat is a separate republic in Russia. They are non-Slavic nation, but they were sent to Ukraine disproportionately in numbers as soldiers to be killed in battle. There are only 600,000 of Buryat in the world. There is a republic within Russia. So Russia is not a true federation, let alone Tuva and all the people from Tuva who were sent, or Yakutia, Sakha, with indigenous names. So I hate to call them indigenous people, because these are the nations within Russia that were conquered. Russia expanded as a land empire. It didn't conquer territories or overseas. It basically just grew. And all these nations, there are many of them that are oppressed and are within Russia. They need to have the independence, to have their rights, language, and culture protected. Okay. So, and to just briefly comment on BRICS. We had a discussion at my university online which was called, is BRICS an alternative to something? Because Russia plays on this BRICS story to present BRICS as something like alternative to the, let's say, Western world. So there is the Western world, like US, the United Kingdom, the big European countries, and there is something like an alternative. But of course, even within BRICS, we know territorial disputes between India and China, for example, and they're also fighting for the control between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean streams, how to control the. So it is a very interesting topic for discussion. And maybe to shut up now and to open the floor for discussion about the dimension, we need to study each other more, because when we Ukrainians tell about the people, the different republics within Russia, even our European colleagues from Western Europe, they're so surprised to hear about Tuva, Yakutia, Buryаты, Kalmyki, Nghanasаны, and many nations in Russia. Some of them even lost the language. Some of them, it is very racist. If I may give this one small example. In 2000, it was last year, the first child to be born in St. Petersburg, second largest city in Russia actually, was from Tuva. So she's not European, so she's not Slavic looking. Appearance is Asian. And we had this collection of comments on social media in Russia saying that these people should stick to the republic and do not go to our European part of Russia. So this is extremely and pure racism, and these peoples are suffering. So my idea is that Russia should reform inside. It should become a true federation where all this national republic have the rights, have the language rights preserved, education, and things like that. And I think this is the way to deal with Russia in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Prof. Zweli, in classic professorial style, asks 2 questions in 5 different parts. So I'm going to pick 1 or 2 points. I'm not going to deal with all of them. I think also Dr. Maxim's done a great job on some of them. So the first one is on the whether we are moving towards a realist international system. That could be one perspective. I will say that it really is also a decision or a viewpoint that one could take, but there's an alternative perspective, which is that in fact we could be moving towards greater global solidarity, a much more solidarist international system, not to be confused with utopianism. The escalation of crisis I think also creates what we keep hearing, the use of strategic nuclear weapons, which would be terrible. And I think for those who are not familiar with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks by the US on Japan, should actually look that up and familiarize with how devastating these weapons are. That could be a rupture point. We don't want to get to that point. If we can change things before we get there, I think it would be great. So I would also, personally, I would push the global solidarist agenda quite strongly, and it is clear that a number of countries, Washington, London, Paris, Beijing, and Moscow, also are not interested in a transition because they control the current system. Or at least they can assert their will, particularly through the United Nations Security Council. UN Security Council reform has been an illusion. It's been like a merry-go-round. I remember quite clearly in 2008, Barack Obama promising the Indians that they should be sitting in the Security Council. And that was 2008. And nothing has happened. Recently, Biden said the same thing about Africa at the US-Africa Summit. Nothing has happened. So don't put on any eggs in the P5 basket. They're going to make lots of omelets, and you're going to be left standing looking quite silly. Then very quickly on peacemaking, you asked what peace might look like. And I think, again, the South African model is useful. The South African model, if you told people there would be a transition out of apartheid into something different, which is where we are now. It's not perfect. Many would have challenged and believed that, because how is it possible for the so-called whites and the blacks to live in South Africa, given everything that has happened in this country? And it was the process, Mandela, secret negotiations, and banning of the African National Congress, the CODESA talks, the formation, the establishment of the Constitution, which creates something that everyone can actually refer to. And we clearly have multiple challenges still to address. Deep socioeconomic divisions. You see the shacks as you drive around South Africa. But that is a model that could potentially work going forward. I did say that can only be achieved without Putin, not with Putin. So in the scenario where Putin is no longer in the scene, it's important to already have a sense of what the peacemaking tracks might look like. And there are a number of initiatives. China, Turkey, Ukraine itself has its own point plan, the African Peace Mission. I think Brazil also has a proposal on the table. So there are many, many different ideas out there. So I think that's important for us to also think about that. And what might be the next phase of the evolution of an African Peace Mission intervention, if Africans are considered to be, legitimate interlocutors, so on and so forth. So I think on BRICS, I think Maxim did a good job. Just to say that Cyril traveled to St. Petersburg to ask Putin not to come to the BRICS summit, and Putin actually stayed away, which saved Cyril Ramaphosa a lot of headache. Potentially could have been very destructive for that meeting. So I am with you on that skepticism about the South Africa's position on the Russian Federation. I think South Africa is also under a lot of pressure from the West to be much more overtly, to state its critique much more clearly. But South Africa is occupying this middle ground, and it's not unique, by the way. Also, India is in this middle ground where it's saying it's talking to both sides. It's not going to pull one side or the other. But let me just stop there before I become equally professorial.
Thank you. Comments, questions?
Yeah, many questions.
Okay. Are you in a room? Okay.
Any questions?
Yes. Oh, yeah,
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? My question is a very short one, and it's targeted at Dr. Maxine. I'm just interested when you spoke about the interview that Putin did with Tucker Carlson, and sort of like, I'd like your opinion on what you think the logic of his argument is, in the sense that similar to how it happened in apartheid South Africa, where the apartheid state said defined Africans as subhuman, then if you define someone as subhuman, it's then easy for you to subjugate them. Similar to what you spoke about, how Putin was saying that Ukraine as a country does not exist, quote unquote. Do you think that that's the logic to say, because Ukraine does not exist as a sovereign country, then you cannot face consequences for invading them? Thank you.
Shall we take more questions?
Thank you to the panelists. It's not really a question, I'm just kind of processing. So we've been speaking about this new security architecture for quite a while now. But when I listen to the input of what that transformation is going to be looking like, it's really just more getting a seat at the same table, in the same structure, with the assumption that if there are diverse voices at the table, processes will change, principles, actions, etc. will change. I don't think that that's a correct assumption. And when countries get into positions of power, they tend to act in exactly the same ways as those who were there before. And so maybe we should be having a discussion that's wider than just a discussion about the UN Charter, even though that might be the first point of call, because we're keeping intact the principles, the values, the structures, etc. There's no new structure being proposed here at all. It's simply an addition of members to the existing structure, as far as I can see. And it will be situated in the very same state system as well. So even that is not being discussed. And I do want to get to what you were reflecting on, Zweli, to that moment of opportunity and what are the markers for that moment of opportunity. And so the League of Nations post the First World War, the UN post the Second World War. We have not seen a world war yet. Are the conflicts, we certainly have seen an increase in conflicts, both inter and interstate conflicts. Are those conflicts sufficient for us to say, well, right, now is the moment for us to review the structure? Or have we learned from history and say, well, we don't actually have to create another third world war in order to transform ourselves. We know that we have to transform. And in relation to South Africa, so South Africa is seizing the moment. It sees a vacuum of leadership. It is positioning itself there. As peace builder, peacemaker, it is certainly emphasizing the human rights elements. That was part of its first foreign policy as well, how it positioned itself post-1994. And it's definitely trying to do that. And stressing international rules-based order. But the same rules. Nobody's speaking about the rules, right? Those rules are staying the same, and maybe we need to be questioning them as well.
Hi, is this working? Okay, cool. I'm also kind of on your earlier point, just in terms of how we're understanding like security architecture and stuff, is also, I'm interested in getting particularly your perspectives on what we kind of understand as like securitizing, because I think there are lots of different, particularly within Europe right now, you know, agents in terms of how they understand security. So the way in which Ukraine understands security is different maybe within a broader scheme of like Europe, and the global architecture is different to how Russia does. So I'm interested in how you guys see with the revamping the security architecture or reimagining it, ways in which that would have to happen that would be seen as securitizing for all countries. So for example, I think if you look at, for example, you can use the EU, maybe extend it to NATO, but they see naturally any expansion of the EU, even though it's an economic organization, is naturally securitizing, but that's not necessarily the case for Russia. It can see that as quite a threatening proposition, which going back to like the Euromaidan, what led to the Euromaidan protests is that was the whole issue, that you could say that Russia felt threatened by Ukraine tying in more into the West, and then, you know, that potentially laying the grounds for NATO expanding into Russia, something that into Ukraine, which is of course on the borders of Russia, which is something that is inherently going to be threatening for Russia. And how do we navigate this? Because I see a lot of the issues with this conflict, and we can, even if we go back to the invasion of Georgia, that came right on the back of the Bucharest summits, where, as I remember, George Bush went in basically wanting to say that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO, and then at the end, the leaders all kind of agreed that one day, they didn't put like a time on it or anything like that, but one day it would become members. And then Russia attacks, and then we kind of see again, in the year preceding, Russia was kind of asking for the US to kind of respect those like 1990 agreement, like not 1 inch further. So we can kind of see these patterns where Russia is obviously feeling threatened. And that's not to at all say that Russia should attack, but in terms of trying to find a way forward where we have, you know, a security architecture that everyone feels secure, and I think is the way in which we get to security. Otherwise, you will always have these destabilizing sort of elements, right? And I think what I'm interested in is that does come down to UN Security Council members a lot of the time. I mean, we can look at what Russia's largely feeling threatened by is potentially US's involvement in this constant like threat of NATO as an extension of the US. So I'm interested, if we had to reimagine that, like, how do we kind of get to that point where these different perspectives and strategic cultures of these countries can actually agree on something that is securitizing?
Thank you very much. I think I will start with these two questions then. Thank you very much for being with this also topic of this interview. Well, we Ukrainians, what we know from history is many examples of, let's say, Ukrainian language. Of course, the idea is that Ukrainian language is a dialect of Russia, is also reflected in the Russian linguistic scholarly text, where Ukrainian language and Ukrainians are called literally small Russians, Malorossi. This is the term that is still referred to when you read the linguistic literature. It is derogatory I believe, and it is wrong, declaring Ukrainian language a dialect, a non-existent language. If Ukrainian language is a dialect, non-existent, we can take a look on over 100 bans imposed on the Ukrainian language, documented since the time of the Russian Empire, where books and even speeches at the monument to Ukrainian authors who published when the Ukrainian language was allowed were forbidden. Kotlarevsky, one of the first who published a book, it was 18th century in the Russian Empire when it was commemoration of his 100th anniversary and the monument in Poltava was opened. It was, I repeat, forbidden even to do speeches in Ukrainian. Okay, so this is an example of the war of Russia against Ukrainian identity, one of the small examples. Let's own the three Holodomors, different in 20s, a big one in 30s, and then after the Second World War, which basically was to eradicate. My colleague, Alexandra, is going to speak about the kidnapping of Ukrainian children who are re-educated to become Russians, who are forbidden to speak Ukrainian. To give you an example of the courages of the Ukrainian nation, which I'm so proud of, in the occupied regions of Zaporizhia, for example, the children have to go to school anyway, okay? So, and parents were not afraid to petition to have instruction in Ukrainian language in schools because this is the language they speak. And this boasts about huge discussions on all Russian federal channels which are purely propagandistic. How come these Ukrainians want to have Ukrainian language? It is non-existent as language. It is all sorry bullshit. So this is to give you an example, is discussion still continues. And that's why we believe this is a different sort of war we have. This is really Russian imperial war of conquest. I'm not even saying about burning books, and even within the Christian tradition, you know, that Kiev and all this Christian story, the books published in Kiev, the long tradition of Orthodox book published, were not accepted as religious texts in Russia and were seen as heretics, even though we're both Orthodox. Because there's differences in languages, of course there are. I mean, until the second half of the 17th century, this part was not part of Russia at all. I mean, again, and this is a long discussion, but you are right saying, I do agree with you, to subjugate people, you have to explain to them they're non-existent. Putin just basically that you are part of Russia, but the Poles, the Hungarians, the Austrians told you you are not. And how can I, as a Ukrainian, live with that? It is stupid. Okay, I love this story. Thank you that somebody mentioned the NATO and European Union expansion. I love this story very much. I mean, positively now, because I think as a scholar, also international organizations, I say that any organization consists of member states. We now have a great example that Baltic Sea is basically inner NATO sea. And how this NATO expansion to the region of Northern Europe happened, was it somebody that from Brussels came to Helsinki and said, join NATO? Not, it was the other way around. Finns were very adamant from the very beginning of this full-scale invasion that we want now to join NATO. And basically Finnish elites persuaded the Swedish elites, let's go along, let's come together. So it was not the NATO as some body of like anonymous countries. There are two wealthy, very wealthy, okay, we have to admit, Finland and Sweden are wealthy Northern European countries, and they really wanted to join NATO. They persuaded other members, persuaded Erdogan with Turkey, persuaded Orban, because they wanted to join NATO. It's not the NATO wanted to have them. It's them who wanted to join NATO. And one more thing is very important. Okay, European Union, of course, I have to mention Denmark. Denmark, of course, was member of NATO, member of European Union, but until 2022, they had this, in Danish called Forsvarsforbehold. They were not participating in European Union security architecture. It was written in the accession procedure. So it was one of the rules that Denmark joins European Union, but does not participate in this thing called security. And in 2022, they did a referendum which abolished this. So they really decided that we need to participate in the European Union security. And this also small, wealthy country decided we need to go along with more security. European Union expansion, NATO expansion. Until 2014, in Ukraine, NATO membership was unpopular. It is true. If we take a look at all Ukrainian public opinion polls until 2014, average Ukrainian did not want Ukraine to be part of NATO. Once Russia did its first invasion, annexation of Crimea, created these fake republics in the east, the public opinion changed. Now there is a consensus, even in the east of Ukraine, that we should be members of the European Union. It was always a popular idea, but NATO popularity actually started from 2014 increasing. Before that, Ukrainians didn't want NATO. This is true. And I compare this to Finland and Sweden, who saw the invasion, who saw the violation of human rights, all this stuff. Finland has its own story of fighting against the Soviet Union and Russian Empire. I mean, Finns were called derogatory terms as a retarded Northern European wild people, like Chuchonce. I mean, if you read Russian, this is true. I mean, so sorry maybe to keep you long, but to sum up, In Bucharest, we were actually not promised membership. I have to correct you. We were not promised at any time NATO membership. Even now, we're waiting, but we are not, never been promised it. So to sum up, yes, this is a war against Ukrainian identity. We need to rethink the world architecture because countries want to join any alliance they see to be protected against a huge country like Russia with nuclear weapons. That's why Finns and Swedes persuaded NATO members to take them in, because there are no other alternatives. So we also have to discuss that. Maybe there should be other alternatives, but they're not there now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions. Yeah, let me start with Cheryl's point. I think I completely agree with you, Cheryl. The nature of the table is not really being transformed at all. It's the same system. It's the same structure. So personally, I'm also not very much in favor of expanding the size of the Security Council. It doesn't really solve anything, particularly when you've got much more powerful countries that know how to manipulate the structure. You are right, there is no new structure being proposed, and this is actually where I am myself as well. How are we going to start the process of proposing a new structure? What does that look like? You know, and it's not simply IGR convening a few policy dialogues. We will convene them. And this is why I think the Article 109, paragraph 3, becomes extremely important, because it actually does call for a general conference to review what a, not only UN, but a multilateral system, the whole thing, can look like, including the global financial architecture, the reform of the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, because we've got urgent issues that need to be addressed. If they're not addressed in the next 5 to 10 years, the world enters a very precipitous decline, dangerous for future generations of human beings. So that is why, for me, the vehicle of Article 109 becomes a very important, let me not say Trojan horse, because then it might sound as though I'm engaged in some nefarious activities, but it is the pathway towards opening up this conversation so that we can actually rethink the structure. Conversations about UN Security Council reform have been going on for 30 years, since 1992, when Boutros Ghali, felt that there was a new world order, but in the end, it was rebuffed by the major powers. I don't think the major powers have any interest in changing the system, at least the P5 specifically, but I still believe we're in a moment of opportunity. I like the fact that you highlighted the markers, the creation of the League of Nations, at the end of the First World War, the creation of the United Nations, at the end of the Second World War, the multiple small wars we have, tiny, small kind of conflicts we have compared to a major global conflagration do not seem to be sufficient to trigger that moment of actually having that global conversation, right? And I'm concerned that it's going to be only when the P5 start to attack each other with nuclear weapons that we enter that stage, which is a dangerous place to be, because then it really becomes, it can escalate. So that would be my suggestion. Let's keep pushing this agenda on this item. Let's do some advocacy. Let's do what civil society and academics and think tanks do best, is raise awareness and push this agenda everywhere we go. And I'm furiously traveling across the continent trying to raise the consciousness of our African government and colleagues on this issue. Very quickly, South Africa as a global peacemaker, global peace builder, stressing an international law-based order on the ICJ intervention, is something that South Africans should not only feel proud of, yes, but also analyze and write about, because if we don't put the story out there, no one really else is putting it out there from our perspective. Then very quickly on securitization, which is a challenging theoretical question. I think securitization and the mind frame that leads to securitization is the problem. The United Nations system was created to contain the problem of securitization. It hasn't really solved that problem In the intervening periods, hundreds of millions of people have died, and the UN as a system of collective security hasn't prevented that. Where we are now, we are in a dangerous trajectory where there is an increased tendency to resort to securitization. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO becomes more powerful. NATO begins to project its power much more around the world. If it does it in a way that it respects international law, there's nothing wrong with that. But we do remember Libya, yes, in 2011. And so there are moments when it can also be used as a force, for change where the people are not involved in making that decision. So for me, the kind of thinking that got you into a problem is not the kind of thinking that's going to get you out of it. So we need the inverse of securitization. What does that look like? And you talked about the importance of all these different strategic cultures to actually have a conversation in terms of what kind of system can they create that will prevent this tendency towards securitization, this reliance on over-militarization, as a way to actually ensure that everybody's freedom, justice is upheld. And that brings us straight back to a global conversation, some kind of a global dialogue where we will sit around the table and everybody will have a chance to contribute towards reimagining what multilateralism looks like. And for me, it's a bigger concern. The powerful countries don't see this as an urgent undertaking. They actually think the system's kind of okay. We tweak it here, we tweak it there. We add a few more people around the table. The Titanic is still sinking, and moving the deck chairs is not going to help. And the Titanic is our planet. It's our Earth. It's our home. So we actually have a responsibility to, again, push this agenda. We're back to Article 109 again, as a global conversation. So please include that in your research.
Shall we take last few questions if you have before we move to the next?
There's one quick.
Yeah, Peter Fabricius from Daily Maverick. Could I ask you, Professor Yakovlev, if, as you say, this was a war of, a war intended to destroy the Ukrainian identity, what explains the timing of it, do you think? I mean, that the contempt for Ukraine's cultural independence and its identity has been around for an awfully long time, I think, in the Russian consciousness. What I'm trying to understand what you think was the trigger for this decision, first of all in 2014 and then again in 2022 to try to extinguish the identity of Ukraine. Thank you.
Any more questions?
A very good question. Thank you so much, because it relates to the Ukrainian inner politics or domestic politics. It's interesting to answer that. I don't have a ready-made answer, but I will provide a couple of guesses. And it's great that I have a colleague at my department who is also my PhD student, who is writing his PhD research on the ways and means and mechanisms Russia tried to take control over the post-Soviet space in general. So why do I start explaining there is that Russia invested a lot, for example, in controlling media and entertainment business. And we now in Ukraine follow a lot of interesting examples of why, for example, all the late night shows, how they were mocking Ukrainian identity, how they were making fun of us Ukrainians. And it is especially now important because this is actually the trade of President Zelensky. He came from that trade basically as a comedian, entertaining people, but the types of jokes they were making, and for example, for Ukrainian performer, the best way to earn more money was to sing something in Russian and to get to the Russian stage to collect more money. And then after, I think, before 2014 and in 2 years ago, what was changing is that we had Poroshenko with a very pro-Ukrainian position, and it's interesting that Ukrainian language gained more in popularity. I read statistics at the end of last year that in over 100 years, Kyiv is finally predominantly Ukrainian language speaking city. our capital. We commissioned, with my School for Policy Analysis, we commission every year, we commission sometimes twice a year, all Ukrainian public opinion surveys, and half a year after the invasion, there was all Ukrainian increase by 7%, and it's not only our numbers, of people who switched completely to speaking using Ukrainian. And this is like 7 all over Ukraine, including the areas where Ukrainian was not that spoken. I traveled to Kharkiv in the east of Ukraine, second largest Ukrainian city. You can really feel the difference. People speak Ukrainian on the streets and the shops. And that was also, we could feel that after 2014. So Putin's position was, I'm not going to negotiate anything with Poroshenko. He's too Ukrainian to me. Just to raise your awareness, everything that is Ukrainian for Putin is branded as Nazi. You know, denazification Putin is fighting basically against everything Ukrainian. So there was great hopes in Russia that when Zelensky comes to power, his first language is Russian, he comes from the central part of Ukraine, maybe he would also pursue this pro-Russian position. But he was wrong in that decision because in Ukraine there's a consensus. We need to rediscover our identity. Ukrainian language and culture is gaining more in popularity, we're gaining more international recognition, stuff like that. European Union membership is more and more popular in Ukraine. We're really getting closer with the European Union, and there are great developments. I can tell you the experience of getting visa-free travel to Europe. I do understand that South African citizens, you need visas for many countries. In the European subcontinent, which is much smaller than Africa, once you got this visa to travel, I can tell you Russians were very jealous. But for us, it was a decision to get closer to European Union rules and norms. So maybe an answer was very general, but I believe that Putin and Kremlin and his clique, they saw that Ukraine is becoming more Ukrainian, basically. Public opinion polls show it. We got much closer to European Union. Zelensky was not what Putin expected, because Putin expected him as a small Russian who would prefer to speak Russian than Ukrainian, would push for this pro-Russian position with neutrality, but it didn't work. So, and I have to also admit that in Ukraine we have this very bloody joke, it's a very bad joke, but we say that Putin actually did a lot for consolidating Ukrainian nation and our identity. So this is true. I don't have a ready-made answer, but you are really right in saying that Putin is still irritated, but how Ukrainian we get by rediscovering our roots and identity. Thank you.
I don't know if I will take a little stab. I'll just wade into this discussion, if I may. I think the ideologues of Russian nationalism have been pushing an agenda quite strongly. And apparently they're even more extreme ideologues than Putin within Russia, right? Who have written tomes and tomes about the need to recreate the great Mother Russia, going back to the ideas of Catherine the Great. And so what we're dealing with is an ideology from 19th century, classical great power, expansionism, and the conquest of regions that are supposed to be under its sphere of influence. So I think Dr. Maxim is absolutely right. The nature of Ukraine was changing fundamentally and shifting. Ukraine has a political association with the European Union, so it's only a question of time. Robert Gates, the former US Secretary of State, wrote his memoirs, a book called The Duty. And in it, he actually has a section where he describes the physical reaction of his Russian counterparts when they raised the issue of NATO expansion. That they were physically and viscerally disturbed by when the Americans put that on the table. It's very interesting to look at that script. And that was 2008. So the Americans knew that somehow this is something that irks the Russians. And that's not an excuse and not a reason. But I'm just saying this is part of the mind frame. And if you think about the early 1990s, unwritten agreement, there is no evidence of it. Unwritten agreement on NATO expansion that feeds into it. Current CIA director, William Burns, actually has written an article called Niet means Niet, in which the Americans have analyzed the limits they think they can push the Russians. And Niet means no, don't expand beyond a certain line. So they knew, the American foreign policy establishment knew exactly what it was doing. It's not an excuse again, I'm saying, but I'm just saying if you understand the profile, the psychological profile of these great expansionist type individuals, then you can understand that if you push them to a certain point, they have definitely got to crack. So the timing, again, I also don't have a ready-made answer, but this is just my analysis. I remember Angela Merkel saying the signing of the Minsk agreements was part of the process, but that they or she had no intention of actually upholding those agreements. That's interesting to do some analysis around there to see if all this fits in some kind of a framework, then we have a much more complex and nuanced situation than we realized. But again, as I said, it is not an excuse to conquer a member of the United Nations system. That's behavior we should have left behind. It shouldn't feature in the 21st century at all, on any basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. I think that concludes our first section. I think maybe we can take a 2-minute sort of leg stretch because we're a little bit behind time. And our next section will cover matters of nuclear safety and occupation of such facilities. And Olenka and is Isabel online? She's online, she's there, okay. And she'll present from there, okay. And there's volume that will come from there. Right, I'll just sit still. I've got more questions for you.
Сюди сонце в мене злива, сюди сонце в мене злива, але я щаслива.
Сюди сонце в тебе злива, сюди сонце в тебе злива, сюди сонце в тебе злива, але ти щаслива. Ой-ой, ой-ой, ой-ой.
Немає сил плакати ночами, все обернулося добре ногами. Мене життя чорні плями, зруйновані всі мої плани.
Hello, guys. I think maybe we can sit and eat and sit and have coffee while we listen to the next section, please. What is that sound? Okay, I think that we must begin. In our next section, we have got Olena Lapenko, and she's going to provide us with some key insights into the challenges that the Russian occupation brings to all matters nuclear. I won't say much, but I'll leave everything to her. Olenka, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Nice to meet you. I am very thankful for inviting me here. I think I'll start with some general information. We will start with the second slide here. This is territory of Ukraine. We have a lot of nuclear facilities here. So in the north of the country, there is an exclusion zone of Chernobyl nuclear power plant. I can show you. It's under Kiev in the map. Yeah. In 1986, during project tests, an accident occurred there. It caused significant pollution. No, can we return to the previous one? No, to previous. To the second slide, please. There is a map of Ukraine. No. Previous. Okay. Yeah. So it caused significant contamination of the surrounding area. Also, under operation in Ukraine is the nuclear subcritical installation. It's just for research purposes. It locates here near Kharkiv. It's like eastern part of Ukraine. And also, before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine operated 4 nuclear power plants with 15 reactors. So they marked here with these beautiful dots. Yeah. And in 2022, Russian attacked Ukraine from 3 sides, from the north, east, and south. So all these objects were more or less damaged during this 2-year full-scale invasion. Due to the fact that this Chernobyl nuclear power plant industrial site is located near the border with Belarus, which supports Russia in its aggression, it was already occupied by Russian troops on the first day of the attack. Exclusion zone of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was under occupation for 33 days. So we can go to the next slide. In the red dots here are places where an increased level of radiation was recorded after the Russian troops entered the site. This Russian invasion caused this a lot of dust from the soil, so a level of radiation increased in 20 times. If we leave the question of killing people, capture and torture, and consider only technical aspects, so the main threats at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant site were numerous shelling and damage to power lines. Objects in the exclusion zone were left without electricity for days. The fuel supply of the diesel generators at the facility was only enough for 24 hours of operation. The threat of complete blackout is the threat of loss of control over the safety systems there. And also there are a lot of cooling equipment in the shelter under the fourth reactor, which was destroyed in 1968. The next slide, please. And also, our research reactor, nuclear subcritical installation in Kharkiv, has a lot of damages from Russian invasion, but Kharkiv was not occupied by Russians. That's why we can deal with these damages now. So this subcritical installation had a lot of damages, especially ventilation ducts of the special ventilation system, ventilation pipe of the main building of the installation, accelerated crystal gallery cooling system, diesel generators for emergency power supply systems. But the most important threat remains the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. It has 6 power units, VVR 1000 type. But 4 of these units now use this Westinghouse fuel. And 2 of them still uses Russian 12. The obvious threat that International Atomic Energy Agency warns about are periodic losses of external power supply. In case of blackouts at the nuclear power plant, the use of 20 diesel generators with a capacity of almost 6 megawatts each is planned. However, the regular supply of diesel is designed for only 10 days of continuous operation. But now we don't know if they have such storages with diesel fuel for supplying these generators. Also, the fact is that in 2023, there were 3 complete blackouts at a nuclear power plant. So it's really dangerous because it can cause the second nuclear accident in the territory of Ukraine. So also international agency reports declares that there is a lack of proper technical maintenance and repairs at the site. Availability of weapons, explosives, military equipment. And one more threat is unqualified personnel at the nuclear power plant. But Dixie Group made research about these threats, and we find out another threats at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The international agency mission doesn't report about these threats, but I think that they will be in their reports in 2024. In the near future, why? Because in the near future, the 6-year term of nuclear fuel operation will end at all these 6 units. So we have a lot of questions here. How will the nuclear fuel overload process take place there? How big is the risk that there will be no blackout during this removal of the nuclear fuel assemblers? And the other one is where will spent nuclear fuel, including United States-made fuel, Westinghouse, be stored? Also, also the Russian side constantly declares its intention to put into operation power stations, because now 2 external power lines came there from Ukrainian side and another 2 from the side that is under Russian occupation. So they can produce electricity there and supply with this with territory under occupation. So, but when working at the production capacities of the stations, a lot of water will be needed to for this cooling needs to cool the reactors. But there is simply nowhere to get this water after the explosion at Kakhovska Dam. They destroyed our hydropower plant, and so the level of water in reservoir is very low for this. We can go to the next slide, and we can now talk about what was done since the start of full-scale invasion. Exactly 2 years ago, the Director General of International Atomic Energy Agency declared 7 indispensable pillars of nuclear safety and security. They are, the first one, the physical integrity of the facilities, whether it is the reactors, fuel ponds, or radioactive waste stores, must be maintained. All safety and security systems and equipment must be always fully functional. The operation staff must be able to fulfill their safety and security duties and have the capacity to make decisions free or of undue pressure. There must be secure off-site power supply from the grid for all nuclear sites. There must be uninterrupted logistical supply chains and transportation to and from the sites. There must be effective on-site and off-site radiation monitoring systems and emergency preparedness and response measures. And finally, there must be reliable communications with regulators. Starting from September the 1st, 2022, a permanent mission of the international agency works there, which records the state of the objects were in nexus. It was for me, it was the first important step, the first success at the level of international agency in the problem of nuclear safety. So representatives of international agency are also present on other nuclear power plants in Ukraine. We have daily reports and long-term reports from this international agency mission, but nuclear safety in Ukraine needs not only monitoring, but also some actions. We have to start doing something to stop and eliminate these threats. What should be the next? As we can see, during these 2 years, there are no effective tools to influence the situation. We can switch to another slide, and maybe the next one. Yeah. So, the precedent with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine raises a lot of questions, not only for our country or European region. The issue of protecting nuclear facilities in the situation of military conflicts is a global problem. What can be done right now? We should develop mechanism of prosecution of violators of nuclear safety, the development of clear sanctions for any country that invades another country should be developed, and they should be provided automatically after the fact of invasion. But also we have to think about development of clear criteria for recognition of military occupation. Creation an environment that will facilitate the creation of conditions for the implementation of United Nations Security Council and international agency resolutions. Another important topic is development of separate procedures and instructions for regulating the operation and protection. All these issues can and should be resolved at the international level, but also we can think now about another platforms, for example, regional platforms. Ukraine have border with countries that also operate these Soviet Union nuclear reactors. So it can be like a regional cooperation. It can be a new platform of nuclear safety. And also the situation with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant for me is a test or something like exam for all these guidelines, regulations, for all the international law. If we now will develop something new, we should test it with this Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant case. We just need to review all our resolutions and think whether this rule would work in the situation with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Only this approach will bring nuclear safety not only to Ukraine or European region and also to the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Next presentation is online, and I've got the presentation here. No, not mine. Oh, I see. Sorry. I don't know whether she can hear me or she can hear us. Oh, okay.
Am I safe to assume that we are proceeding with my presentation? for accommodating me this way. Okay, Zvinka says you can all hear me. That's great. Okay. Yeah, so as I said, thank you for accommodating me this way. I'm going to add to Olena's presentation relating to nuclear safety during armed conflict. And I hope that you will see the ways in which this ties together, and also get a glimpse of what will be in our publication. So I'm going to start off just briefly with the issue of terminology, and then I will proceed with looking a little bit at the African Nuclear Regulatory Framework, and to hopefully show how that ties in to the broader discussions we have here, and really the role of African states in creating lasting peace, but also in this very important task of kind of overhauling the multilateral system and making it more inclusive, making it more fair. From there, I will then look at international law and the protection it offers to nuclear installations. And then just briefly, in closing, I will look at the IAEA's, that is the International Atomic Energy Agency's, response to the occupation of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. So I'm starting off with this issue of terminology, and I'm relying on the IAEA's definitions here of nuclear safety and nuclear security to hopefully illustrate what is really at stake here, and how what has been happening in Ukraine, first with the occupation of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and then the escalating situation at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but also the other nuclear facilities that are at risk in Ukraine. So firstly, nuclear safety, the IAEA defines as the achievement of proper operating conditions, prevention of accidents, and mitigation of accident consequences, resulting in protection of workers, the public, and the environment from undue radiation risks. And then nuclear security, the prevention and detection of and response to criminal or intentional unauthorized acts involving or directed at nuclear material, other radioactive material, associated facilities, or associated activities. And so here we really see a kind of threat and response situation, even in the IAEA's own reaction to this, coming directly from its definitions. So then a little bit of focus on the African Nuclear Regulatory Framework. So non-proliferation, safety, and security are all ideals that have been deeply embedded in this framework on the African continent. Many African states since independence, but also continuing right now, are strong supporters of the peaceful uses of nuclear science and technology, and recognize the significant contribution that it can make to achieving development goals. So the continent already supports several international regulatory frameworks related to nuclear safety and security, non-proliferation and disarmament. It is not limited to these, but these are some of the major ones. So the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, only one African state is not a member state there. Then the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the TPNW. We have 17 signatories and 16 ratifications. Then the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. One has signed but not ratified, and another state not signed. Unfortunately, one of these states that have not ratified is part of the 44 listed in Annex 2 of the CTBT, which is keeping it from entering into force. But nevertheless, there is widespread support for the treaty on the continent. Then the IAEA's Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, as well as its amendment. And then the various IAEA safeguards and other initiatives that has been implemented in close partnership with the continent. But then outside of this international framework, Africa has a robust homegrown nuclear regulatory framework and institutions that actually complement and in some cases surpass the international frameworks to which it belongs. So here I'll just briefly focus on AFRA, the FNRBA, and most importantly here, the Treaty of Pelindaba, and established under the treaty, the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, AFCON. My slides won't move. There we go. So AFRA, the African Regional Cooperation Agreement for Research, Training and Development related to nuclear science and technology. This agreement entered into force before the Pelindaba Treaty on the 4th of April 1990. Its aim is to support socioeconomic development on the continent through nuclear science and technology. If you hear background noise, that is my dog. I apologize. I just live in their world. They are in the room with me. And then the AFRA mission statement is to be the leading regional organization in Africa and a vehicle of member states for the effective promotion and coordination of peaceful applications of nuclear science and technology for socio-economic development on the African continent. AFRA is specifically mentioned in Article 8.3 of the Treaty of Pelindaba. This reads, parties are encouraged to make use of the program of assistance available in IAEA and in this connection to strengthen cooperation under the African Regional Cooperation Agreement for Research, Training and Development related to nuclear science and technology. And moving on to the Forum of Nuclear Regulatory Bodies in Africa, the FNRBA. This was established in 2009 and it actually forms part of the IAEA's Global Nuclear Security and Safety Network. It was established with the purpose to enhance, strengthen, and harmonize the radiation protection, nuclear safety, and security regulatory infrastructure and framework among its members. It has hosted several successful training workshops across the continent over many years, and it is active across 6 thematic areas: legislative and regulatory infrastructure, radiation and waste safety, nuclear safety infrastructure, emergency preparedness and response, transport safety infrastructure, and nuclear security infrastructure. And here we really see a kind of interplay between the legal and the practical. The FNRBA's 2021-2022 action plan was focused on overseeing the safety and security of radioactive material, the development of regulations for securing these sources, including a transport security exercise, FNRBA working group meetings, a regional workshop on a nuclear security culture, and a survey on the status of the radioactive material of FNRBA members. But then the framework I really want to draw your attention to is the African Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, or as it is commonly known, the Treaty of Pelindaba. And there is a map on the left, which I've compiled to show the status of the Treaty of Pelindaba on the continent. And you will note that there's a total of 44 state parties and 52 signatory states, with 1 state having currently taken no action on the treaty. So the Treaty of Pelindaba opened for signature in 1996 and entered into force in 2009. And in many ways, the treaty is revolutionary, in part because it really emphasizes and brings to the fore the peaceful uses pillar of the Non-Proliferation Treaty of the NPT, but also because of Article 10 and 11, and this is really relevant in what we are discussing today, the threats of armed attack to nuclear installations. So Article 10 and Article 11 of the Treaty of Pelindaba. Article 10, which relates to the physical protection of nuclear materials and facilities. Article 10 states that each party undertakes to maintain the highest standards of security and effective physical protection of nuclear materials, facilities, and equipment to prevent theft or unauthorized use and handling. To that end, each party undertakes to apply measures of physical protection equivalent to those provided for in the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and in recommendations and guidelines developed by the IAEA for that purpose. And I think that in itself is quite important because it really shows the respect for, adherence to, and value added to the international frameworks that are then worked in to the continental frameworks. And as you will see in Article 11, where it surpasses somewhat the prohibition of armed attack on nuclear installations. And this is what sets the Treaty of Pelindaba apart as exemplary. So under Article 11, each party undertakes not to take or assist or encourage any action aimed at an armed attack by conventional or other means against nuclear installations in the African nuclear weapon-free zone. So the Treaty of Pelindaba establishes the continent of Africa as a nuclear weapon-free zone, making it one of only 3 in the world. And under the Treaty of Pelindaba, it also established the African Commission on Nuclear Energy, which is headquartered in South Africa, and is tasked with ensuring that states adhere to their obligations under the treaty, but to also advance the peaceful uses of nuclear energy for development purposes. Then quickly looking at the international law and the protection of nuclear installations under international law. So at present, there are no international treaties that govern the protection of nuclear installations against armed attack like Pelindaba does. But that doesn't mean that nuclear installations are unprotected in international law. What we do have are 2 additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and we also have the rules of international humanitarian law. So we have customary law rather than treaty law. And precisely because there is no international treaty law on this, customary law carries more weight. And you can see there I've used this opportunity for a tiny bit of promotion. I did write a paper on legal protection for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, matters for nuclear installations everywhere, where this is discussed a little bit more. I would like to encourage you to read that. But you can see there where I've put the little glasses. I always do that for myself when I take notes, to draw your attention to it, to rule number 42 of the Rules of International Humanitarian Law, which states that particular care must be taken if works and installations containing dangerous forces, namely dams, dikes, and nuclear electrical generating stations, and other installations located at or in their vicinity are attacked in order to avoid the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. And then I want to also draw your attention to Article 15 of Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions and Article 56(1) of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which states, works or installations containing dangerous forces, namely dams, dikes, and nuclear electrical generating stations, shall not be made the object of attack, even where these objects are military objectives, if such attack may cause the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. Other military objectives located at or in the vicinity of these works or installations shall not be made the object of attack, if such attack may cause the release of dangerous forces from the works or installations and consequent severe losses among the civilian population. You will note that the language here becomes quite important, and many legal experts will argue that the phrase may cause becomes problematic and really open to interpretation. And it really becomes a matter then of in whose assessment. So that details one of the shortcomings of international law and enforcing international law. And then to just quickly look at the IAEA's response to the occupation of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. I cannot go into detail of exactly what that has entailed, but there are several long, very detailed reports on this published by the IAEA. But what we have seen since the initial occupation of Chernobyl on the 24th of Feb 2022 are several statements, emergency meetings, reports on the situation on the ground, both in Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, several safety and security inspections, often led by the Director General Rafael Grossi himself. We have seen, as Olena also mentioned, IAEA experts permanently stationed at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as the other nuclear facilities in Ukraine, which, as the Director General himself has reminded us, are also or could also be at risk, and they are there in a monitoring role. We have seen technical support and assistance from the IAEA, the delivery of critical equipment, briefings to the Security Council calling for an end to shelling near the plant, as well as briefings to the General Assembly. And then, importantly, but not yet in practice, although it has received widespread international support, is calls from the IAEA for the creation of a nuclear safety and security protection zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I just want to also highlight the statement from the IAEA's Director General on the situation at Zaporizhzhia, where he said that the situation is unprecedented. It is the first time a military conflict has occurred amid the facilities of a large established nuclear power program. A nuclear accident can have serious impacts within the country and beyond its borders. Indeed, that is true, but while this is the first time that we're seeing this in practice, the concern and the fear that this might happen has existed for a long time. And so I want to end this presentation by asking what more can be done. And I'm just going to give two suggestions here. And my first one is that we certainly need greater follow through and political will to do what is necessary. So as mentioned, the recognition that nuclear installations can be at risk during armed conflict has been well known for a number of years. And here I'd like to actually draw on an example from the IAEA itself, going back to Resolution 533 of October 1990 from the General Conference that year. It says, the General Conference, aware of the fact that an armed attack on a nuclear installation could result in radioactive releases with grave consequences within and beyond the boundaries of the state which has been attacked, convinced of the need to prohibit armed attacks on nuclear installations from which such releases could occur, and of the urgency of concluding an international agreement in this regard, and aware of the ongoing work of the Conference on Disarmament with a view to concluding an international agreement in this regard, one recognizes that attacks or threats of attack on nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes could jeopardize the development of nuclear energy. Two, considers that the safeguard system of the agency is a reliable means of verifying the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and then goes on to point number 7, where it urges all states to cooperate in achieving a successful resolution of the issue in the near future. And I think that now this is more pertinent than ever, and perhaps this is an opportunity for African states in its push for lasting peace to also bring about the agreement of an international treaty preventing the armed attack on nuclear installations. And then my second suggestion is that we should also recognize the limitations. Firstly, the IAEA has a very specific mandate in which it can operate, but it also often has to rely on the permission of member states. And as we'll see in the case of the occupation of Zaporizhzhia, Zaporizhzhia has been occupied by invading forces since the 4th of March 2022, and the IAEA only gained access on the 1st of September. So we need to also be realistic about what the agency can and cannot do. But then also we need to recognize that international law has limitations, and it's clear that there are issues with implementing international law. And I think Olena made a point about rules being tested. Although the Treaty of Pelindaba does have Article 11 that prohibits the armed attack, we've never had to see it exercised and to see how that would play out in practice. So I'm going to end it there, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to open it up before and then make final comments afterwards, because we are chasing time at the moment. And so are there any questions? We could maybe take some round of questions. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, just to both speakers, I'm particularly perhaps to Isabel, since she referred to the fact that there's some reference in the Geneva Conventions to prohibit, attacks on nuclear facilities. But she also said, so I guess this question is directed more at her, but she also said that there are, after saying that there's no treaty prohibitions. I mean, are the conventions not considered to be treaty instruments for prohibiting? And I mean, is there any way that the Geneva Conventions could be invoked now to seek some kind of punishment or control or restriction on Russia's action?
Thanks. Oh. I have one general one, though, and I think it's sort of linked with maybe the previous session. But after reading the draft policy brief here, I do see that there's this kind of mention of sanctions as a way to try and, should we say, manage the consequences of firing at or misusing nuclear facilities. And the sanctions debate is a broader one, I think. And I think that it's one that, obviously, as a person from South Africa, find interesting. And I'm curious about whether or not you think, in the context of this conflict, whether sanctions has been a reliable instrument to curtail behavior under occupation.
Thanks. And Isabel didn't hear the first question, so we'll ask to repeat it.
Okay. Can you hear me now, Isabel? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Thanks.
So my question was just to about international law. You mentioned that there's no treaty that explicitly prohibits, or no dedicated treaty that explicitly prohibits the attacking of nuclear facilities, but you also said that there are two protocols in the Geneva Convention, and maybe this is a semantic question, but you also said there's no treaty prohibition. But do the Geneva Conventions not constitute some kind of treaty prohibition? And in any case, can they not be invoked to prosecute or whatever, punish Russia for this event? Thank you.
And if you can answer very quickly, because we are pressed for time.
Sure. Okay, shall I go first? I think that is quite an interesting question, and I think semantic certainly is the right word to use here, especially when we're talking about laws. It comes down to the letter sometimes. I think in answering this question, we need to really assess in practice what does carry the most weight. I think the problem here is that parties to even customary law can withdraw. So, for example, the Russian Federation withdrew from Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions in 2019. And then it becomes a question of how do you enforce something on a party that is no longer bound by its obligations. So I would leave that as my kind of response, because it's, as I said, it is a semantic issue in itself. I hope that gave some more guidance.
Speaking about sanctions, our Ukrainian community ask a lot of questions. For example, why Rosatom still not under European or United States sanctions? The second question is why Russia is still in different research projects, For example, in EAEA projects, for example, they work on these small nuclear reactors, on developing such technologies. It is very perspective, and it Russia will earn a lot of money from this huge market. Also, why Rosatom still cooperates with European companies, for example, Framatome. So there's a lot of questions, but from the point of view, from the global point of view, there is no such like algorithms. There is only one way, it's economic sanctions. So we can develop some mechanism that will impose economic sanctions in different financial transactions or something like this. So sanctions is the only instrument from this, you know, all these international law resolutions, it's like declarations. But we also have another table with actions. So sanctions, it will be actions. We have no military answer for such kind of aggression. That's why we have only economic tools. So there should be a list of these economic tools in the list of possible sanctions.
Thanks. Should we maybe take one last round of questions, or do you think we are done? No? It's fine. Yes. Okay, thank you very much, guys. Thanks for that. Thank you, thank you. Okay, I think we are into our third and last session. Dr. Elvis Fokala and Alexandra Romantsova. Hope I pronounced it correctly, yes. And I think that here we will concern ourselves with the issue of the forced deportation of children and all the civil liberty issues that it raises. I think I've got your presentation here. Yeah. I think it's here. So maybe... It will be on after Elvis. Oh, I see. Okay. 5-10 minutes each? Yeah? Thanks.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you. It will be afternoon very soon, I think, in a couple of minutes. But greetings to everyone. The reason why we always have these student conversations in this space and why we are looking at it now from the lens of Ukraine and Russia as well is very important. And one of my thinking and philosophies around children's conversations is that everyone needs to be concerned when it comes to a child. And there's just simple one reason about that. Everyone has an experience of childhood. There is no one who became an adult without being a child. So for that reason, we have different platforms, different environments, and how we experience childhood in our different places. But this is completely different for a certain group of children from Ukraine. In the space that while you and I spend time having porridge, you and I spend time having good things, during our childhood, we went to the park to play, some of us played soccer, some of us did all sorts of things. Since 2022, a good number of children in Ukraine have been deprived of this. They've been deprived of, one, their right to play. They've been deprived of, two, their right to freedom. They've been deprived of, three, their right of just being a child. The right just to be a child. And this is what is happening. When all these nuclear systems and all these security measures that adults design and agree on, when these things fail, those who have no powers or even how to even shift the bar or regulate the system, you find them in that situation. The good news is, when it comes to law, almost all United Nations countries, member states that is, have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, except the United States. that has not ratified any of those children's rights related instruments. And one of their reasons is because they have a good children's rights mechanism at home in the United States. So no need to duplicate it by ratifying the international conventions. And this is almost the same reason why South Africa also took a long time to ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, because the country felt that we have a good provision in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that provides economic rights to its citizens. And a good case, a trajectory that we do not need to ratify these international instruments. But the argument then in 2015, yes, before 2015 and in 2015 when South Africa then ratified, was that there is need for you to provide a different platform of redress in case people fail to access that's economic rights. And then South Africa went on to ratify. But we sit in a world in a crisis where Ukraine and Russia have both ratified these two instruments, or this instrument, but there is no accounting mechanism that really looks at holding, for example, Russia, who is in this case guilty of stealing, for lack of a better word, or abducting, as we say it in the right legal term, children, a good number of them from Ukraine, taking them into Russia, and then reconfiguring their mindset to now become Russians and to hate Ukraine. In other words, building a certain group of human beings that when they transcend childhood to adulthood, then they have this resentment in them that will continue this war. In the next set of war that will come, we'll find these children fighting against their parent country. But if we shift a bit from there, do we have a history in this continent about children who have been abducted? We do. We do have a history of children who have been trafficked. We have a history of children who have been stolen. We have a history of children who have been removed or abducted from their original place. And one of them, and a very quick one, is what happened in Nigeria with the Boko Haram situation, where young girls were removed from schools and from their community, and taken to a different space. And the African Union has been very, in my own thinking, and what I know happens is that they've been reactionary on this. There's no proactive step that has been taken. And I'll tell us why we don't have that proactive step even within the international community. Is that when you look at the African Union, they want to see, access, and evaluate and ascertain the fact that this number of kids were removed from this place and taken to this place, and then send an email or a statement that we want these kids to be brought back. When that happened, and in Nigeria, as of Sunday, the African Union issued a statement asking for the children, 280 children, to be sent back to the Kaduna region in Nigeria because they were abducted, from schools and all whatnot, which is supposed to be a safe space. Within the international framework, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child as well has also issued a statement calling on Russia to at least, behave when it comes to all these crises, or at least protect children in these spaces. But that deafness of listening to international statements, or that deafness of respecting international provisions or international order, it's very common within adults. It is extremely common, and one of the major reasons is because most of the existing mechanisms that deal with children's rights issues do only pass recommendations, and they don't make binding decisions like the ICC will do, the International Criminal Court. And in my argument on this journey that we've been is that if you ask me if we can configure the ICC or look at the juvenile justice system within the ICC, can we reconfigure it for it to protect children more? And I'll tell you, we don't need to bother about that. The reason is because for us to reconfigure the ICC will take a lot of time than just creating a different mechanism that will actually target children's rights issues. And will also give these children at least some space to enjoy their childhood. We don't have that within the international mechanisms. We have the IGSJ, it's an adult-centric institution. We have the ICC, it's an adult-centric institution. The only two major international child-centric institutions that we have is the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child and the African Children's Committee on the Rights of the Child. These two institutions only make recommendations. Some scholars, and us included, we've referred to it as a quasi or quasi-judicial institutions. So they make just recommendations. And states then have the option to follow those recommendations or not to follow those recommendations. If we do not take a stand now to ensure that the international community also resonates with the number of children who have been removed from many countries, and Russia is what we are discussing now, is that we will have a lot of children across this globe, and one could be yours, that will be deprived from their childhood. So this really pains me a lot, and I think all of us need to take that same pain or feel the same pinch, because we know someone who is a child, and we've all been children before. Thank you.
Yep. And there's just a... Changes, acknowledges right here. Okay, colleagues, hello. My name is Alexandra Romantsova. I'm Executive Director, Center for Civil Liberties. It's a human rights defending organization. We work from 2007. And before 2014, we exactly concentrate our attention for standards of human rights inside the Ukraine. And we continue to do that. I'm coming to Center for Civil Liberties from business sector. I left bank to started work there, and one of my first tasks started be, it's war crimes. I know that most of people outside of Ukraine think that war started 24 February 2022. It's not true. War started 2014 from occupation of Crimea, which exactly near of my native region, Mykolaiv. Maybe you heard about them. It's one of the really hard battles point now. So what that means, documented war crime? That means we're going to the field mission together with the volunteer lawyers, journalists, human rights defenders, activists who wanna exactly document what happened there. And we was the first who exactly started to do that at Ukraine, because before 30 years at Ukraine, we don't have any participation, any war campaign. Like you can compare, like Russia Federation have more than 10. But main idea was that we need to be there because we are not state, we are not people who have some interest, we just want to document war crimes. For statistic, for understanding, from 2014 till 2022, so this time of war when they located at the Donbass and Crimea, we documented more than 20,000 cases of war crimes, crimes against humanity. Most of them, that was kidnapping, illegally detaining people, torturing. So all the practice with after 2022, we see at the Bucha, we see at the Izum, all of this happened at Donetsk and Crimea. And at Crimea, one of point was, for example, recruitment people to Russian army and send them to fight against the Ukrainian population at the Donbass. So all of this we documented before invasion. 24 February 2022 changed the situation because war coming at the near of my home at Kiev. Just 3 weeks before, 2 rockets fallen near my house in the middle of Kiev. Why it happened? Because exactly now we don't have enough guns to defend our cities. Such city like Kherson or native for family of Maxim city, Kharkiv, bombed every day. What that means? That means that adult people in absolutely dangerous situation. But what that means for children? That means the children at the war zone were absolutely impossible protect themselves totally. But what we can do, we can move them from there for secure region, or we can help them even. International humanitarian law speak about that you need to remove them from unsecured region or unsecured zone. But what happened with the children who controlled by Russian forces? Because this territory was occupied, or because, for example, relatives who doesn't have any opportunity cross the front line because Russian forces don't give green corridors for evacuation civilians. So they need to go to the territory of Russia Federation to go around of Ukraine territory who exactly at the attack and going to Europe, and after this back to Ukraine. So it's one of situation after which we have a children who stay at the territory of Russia Federation absolutely under control of Russian powers. So if it's possible, next slide. Let's start it from numbers. It's quite mystery. Why so? Because we don't have full information how much children, Ukrainian citizens, stay now at the territory of Russia Federation forcibly displayed there. Why so? Because, for example, 700,000, that numbers which Maria Lvova-Belova, so-called Ombudsman of Human Rights, Ombudsman of Children Rights at Russia Federation, speak about. But here it's for 10 years, and that's some of children can be together with relatives. But that means, for example, all the children will be at the system of indoctrination through, how they called it in Russia. That means they explain that Ukraine not exist, all of you know about Ukrainian life, it's false, Ukrainian language banned it, and all of this. We will speak about that a little later. But surely we know that 20,000 children, which exactly Ukraine have, because all of them was carried by Ukrainian state system, they are there. And what Russia Federation need to do because of international humanitarian law? They need to give information for Ukraine. For example, these children was in the risk zone, that's why we removed them, but here we are, all the information about the children, where they are, what condition they are, what health they have, and all of this. No, it's not happened. First of all, Ukraine don't have numbers because Russian don't give any information about these children. Except that children's then younger than 5, they change the names, they change the data of birth, they don't give them any information about where they're from. And again, it's 2 years, so from 5 till 7, it's absolutely different children's. And what children at 5 don't care about where I'm from, I'm just can sleep and don't hear the boo boo every time. But at 7, it needs to be started connection with my culture, with my native lands and all of this. 500 children in different way, NGOs, not state, have a possibility to read back from Ukraine. Next slide. What kind of the groups? We need to understand it's different, absolutely different legal status of these children from beginning. One of the group is, for example, children, like I told about, relatives decide, or Russian forces decide to evacuate them through the territory of Russia Federation. But that means that all the doors open? No. That means that each family need to pass so-called filtration. Filtration officially legal during the war. But what happened with filtration at the border between occupied territory of Ukraine and Russia Federation territory, it's absolutely illegal. It's one of the places which exactly like a black hole, people absolutely disappeared. Most of them men, but quite a lot it's women. What happened with the children with unfiltrated parents? They just send them next point at the Russia Federation without any connection with the relatives, and we have few such cases which have a happy end. Father was arrested, 3 children was sent to orphan house in the Russia Federation. He exactly escaped and take a possibility to take them back. Now they live in Lithuania. But it's happy end story, and we know about that. How much children without any connection with relatives after filtration stay there, we don't know. Next one, really important understanding the children who is really in dangerous situation. It's orphan children or children caring by state because they social orphans. It's called, that means that parents have inappropriate behavior, and that's why they study in special institution. So with these children, it's more difficult situation, because when, just imagine, next one, just imagine what the example. That's south of Ukraine. Here, it's Black Sea here, Russian here. Kherson and small city Skadovsk. Skadovsk have really important institutions. It's orphan house where the children with disability from birth. And that's orphan house really close to me, because my university support them more than 15 years, and first 10 years we just have a program to connect with them. Last 5 years we create special scholarship. Children from there have a possibility be educated in our university. So alumni from this place, from Skadovsk, they call me, alumni of this orphan house, they call me and told about that from Crimea come so-called Russian doctors, and told that all of these children need to be replaced at the Crimea. Some of these children can't move because they have a disability with part of their bodies, and at the Crimea, not exists such institution which can be comfortable for these children. 46 children was removed in the territory of Crimea and put in a psychiatrist hospital with adults who have different illnesses, and sure, it's not absolutely a place where the children need to be. It's one of example, but here you see track how we Rebecca, girl who exactly was sent by mom to Skadovsk for grandma. She thinks that it will be more secured. Kherson was released by Ukrainian army, and Russian forces who occupied other part of Kherson region and Skadov same, don't give any opportunity exactly cross it just 64 kilometers. Just do that one day way. That's why volunteers exactly send them from Kherson region to Crimea, Kuban, it's region of Russia Federation. After this, as you see, to Moscow, from Moscow to Belarus, Minsk. After this to Warsaw, and bring her back to Kherson to her mom. And it's good story. I mean, happy end story. It's a huge problem, because first of all, state authorities of Russia Federation don't give you opportunity to just take them back because you're responsible state representative. No, only if you have relatives, blood relatives who have documents, and you come to Russia Federation, you spend a few months there, it's not cheap, absolutely. And we have one cases when grandma coming to her two grandsons, and she was asking by FSB, it's Federal Security Bureau, it's Security Service Russia Federation, and she's dying by heart attack. And now we need to reback not only these two children's, but body of their grandma. So it's a dangerous way, it's a huge numerous of different transport, and all this time you are not sure that Russian border guards not told you that they are Russian citizens. We don't give any permission to get out from here. Next one. Like Elvis really important says that we don't have a time. Childhood, it's absolutely will finish after some age. And a lot of teenagers who now bringing to the territory of Russia Federation, and we have possibility bring them back, that 3 really good, happy story, because they finished that children stay at the security at the territory of Ukraine together with their parents or relatives. But all of these children who we return, we can speak with, and they describe how this process feeling. Because Russia Federation looks like rich country, but any comfortable process inside this rich country for children not exist, even for Russian children. But Ukrainian children who exactly not only need to be secured, but after this, next one, they need to be re-educated, they need to be renew their personal identity. And these children comes to the school, whereas the other children, Russian children, every day from TV listen about fascist, Ukronazist, and all of this. How it's finished? It's finished fighting. It's finished by bullying. It's finished exactly the children not going to the school. Because these children, it's like 13, 15 years old, and somebody told them, we know how that was in Kiev, and they seem to know it. That was absolutely normal. My family speak Russian, for example, like my family, and nobody exactly don't have any problem with that. They can, like, they broke this virtual reality which exactly Russian television create. And for your understanding, Maria Lvova-Belova, this Ombudsman for Children's Rights at Ukraine, told about the children was not adept, but we have information for more than 200 children who was adopted by Russian families. And at the beginning 2023, 5 of these children died. One of, we have reason, suicide. Nobody investigate what happened. And here you see that it's not only Russia Federation use it for their structure to re-educate these children. 2,100 children from age from 6 to 15 was sent to the territory of Belarus. You know, Belarus is a so-called partner state of Russia Federation. But Russia Federation really interesting that partner state was included all of this process with the children. And if you see good, this like near 10, 12 years old children who educated how shooting. It's re-education that include patriotic military education. Here, young, really small girl, like till 5, she had a weapon here. So it's not only, it's absolutely every time speaking that best career, it's exactly army, Russian army, every day. And last exactly my slide. It's not so easy exactly going from children from Ukraine, from occupied territory. It's Ukraine, it's occupied territory. It's Artsykh, it's from here. They bring, and they send them to so-called rest camp to Belarus all this way. Why? Because Russia Federation spread the idea that you could re-educate these children till they're not feeling they absolutely Russians. But in the same way, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of, they call education, yeah, просвещение, education, просвещение, education, yeah. Ministry of Education, Russia Federation have a lot of instruction, which exactly independent Russian journalists put in their article about that all of the structure of Russia Federation feel that these children's potential terrorists, and they can resist. Because they don't have natural for Russian children's like willing to respect Russian state. So these children who put the questions, speak about what they truly know, their life in Ukraine, they think they're a potential terrorists. What that means? That means most of them at 18 years will be providing going to army. Because what happened now with demographic at the Russia Federation, they send to the army whole who exactly they're not interested in. They're not interested at the population of ethnic republic, where the people looks like Asian, where the people looks like Arabic type. They send them to army and they stealing from the territory of Ukraine European-looking children and trying to reintegrate them to the understanding great Russia. It's not a problem with the Russian language. It's not a problem with the Russian like ethnic group or identity. It's a problem then Russian now that means supporting Putin politics. That's a problem because it's politics not about human rights. And Russia Federation absolutely destroyed a system of human rights 20 years before started. And there are two big differences between Ukraine and Russian society. We 30 years live and trying to solve our problem using the freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful demonstration, freedom of movement, association, all of this, which give you fundamental political rights. Russia Federation cut for any person who trying to stop this shrinking of space for human rights, all these people now on the jail, push out from the country, unlike my friend Oleg Orlov, human rights defenders from Russian Memorial, need to sit at the jail 2.5 years because he wrote an article about truth. So children's, it's really limited time group. And we need to help them, first of all, save them there and have a possibility back to security space where they can use their human rights and children's rights. Thank you.
Thank you. That wasn't, yeah. I have more questions than answers, unfortunately. And it's just a very, very different part of this, I don't know what to use the word, conflict that I've never understood about how this happens, right? And I have seen the peace, the African peace plan that does point this out. And I must say, at the time, I was like, why does it have this thing around, children, whatnot? And I'm just curious, like, what is the motivation? Because that number is a staggering number. 744,000 children confirmed by the UN. And I'm curious about what the motivation is. And two, how does it work? Like, how do you go to a war zone or anywhere else and just, I'm just curious, sorry.
Shall we take some more questions?
Yeah, maybe take some more, yeah.
From the floor.
Let's start it.
My question is for Professor Fokala. As you were speaking, I was just thinking of the DRC warlord, Bosco Ntaganda, who was prosecuted at the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And part of the charges of war crimes was his use of child soldiers. I'm no longer a teenager and I've never held a gun, so I can imagine how harrowing it must be for a 13-year-old to be given an AK-47 and sent into combat. So I suppose my question is, because you spoke about the United Nations Center for Children and the African Union Center for Children, are you saying that what is ideal would be there should be a specific international court that is dedicated to prosecuting crimes against and involving children? Thank you.
Any more questions?
Oh, sorry, there's one. Oh, sorry.
We have to.
Mine is not directly related to children, but what I am picking up is that there are obviously also divisions within Russia, right? You're speaking about other groups being oppressed, etc., discriminated in Russia. And I'm wondering what connections Ukrainians are making with those groups so that there is more of a united front coming from there, because you exploit cleavages in a conflict situation. And I'm just wondering about that dynamic.
Thanks very much. Could you just give us some idea of how many children have been released? Maybe I might have missed that. And
500 for now.
oh, okay, and how that was done, and if you could, I mean, there's been some suggestion that South Africa might have played a role or tried to play a role, and I wonder if you could just clarify if there was in fact any South African involvement in attempts and in successes. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm started and give you back. First of all, about motivation. First of all, we don't know what happened in the Putin minds, because for this process, they prepare much longer than invasion started. They changed the legislation for these children, which they're now using for these children 2 years before invasion, so 4 years before. It's one. Second, now we're trying to investigate where the children are. So how we do that? First of all, it's through internet, through OSINT, so open sources information taking, and non-open sources. But exactly, we have a cyber war now between Ukrainian and Russian hackers. So, and it shows us the whole the system around the education and social caring at the Russia Federation involved in all of this process. So schools, universities now taking group of children for them, have a such course of patriotic education, and these universities still have 300 university partners all over the world. And that's really important to understand. It's a system, and Putin gives a special budget from his special funds for this. And he speaks about it openly, together with Maria Lvova-Belova, and that's why ICC have a possibility exactly open the case and give the warrant to of this person, because they do that publicly. They do that like they make a commerce, all of this. So I think for them, motivation from two sides. From one side, Russia have a demographic crisis. A demographic crisis, exactly. Numerous of people with European looking, they shrinking. So that's way how they can change it from one side. From other side, for them, it's a part of virtual world which created by propaganda that we care about children. It's a war there. It's not war. It's like special operation there. But we need to save the children. That's why we bring them. But after this, these children absolutely drawing in at the bad organized system. Because if you want, you can hear press conference of adult, like young adult children who was back first from group of 300 children, and they speak about all of this. They drop them from one rest camp to other, so they separate them. That was bigger group, they know each other. After this, they make a smaller group. And that happened, huge territory of Russia Federation. They send them out really far from Ukraine territory and all of this. So how we reback them? Mostly, biggest possibility if we have relatives. So in this way, you can appeal, you can spend 2 months at the territory of Russia Federation, you can speak with FSB, you can give all the arguments that you are relative, and that's why you can bring them back. But it's possible doing only with NGO support. Such support, we have a Coalition for Children's Rights. At the Ukraine, it's like 6 main NGOs who collaborate with Ombudsman Office, but mostly they do that in the horizontal level. And last one, we need to understand. Again, it's not a problem with language. My family, for example, my mom can express herself in Ukrainian. She speaks only Russian. But she understood mostly Russian, Ukrainian. It's not a problem for us. It's absolutely normal in Ukraine when you see 2 persons who speak Russian and Ukrainian in one dialogue. It's absolutely okay for us. Because it's not about language. It's about how people made from language weapon. Because now, when Ukrainian language absolutely banned it, when you can say that Ukraine was normal, for these children, Russian language, it will be violent action against them. So that's a problem, exactly. Mm-hmm.
You are very correct. That is one of the things that we're trying to advocate for in that space. But what I want to, you see, most of us who have dogs in our yards or at home as part of our families, very few, if out of 10, maybe 1 person bought an adult dog. All of us go for puppies, because then you have the space and the time, to tame or to train the dog, to understand your household and your culture, or to understand at least the culture or religion around that family, and to love everyone around the family. So it becomes very easy to take children, because in that same understanding, when you take a child as young as they are, then you are able to train them over a period of time. What is very painful as well is that some of these children are orphans. Some of them are children without parental care. Some of them are children who had no present adult in human form in their lives, or maybe have the state that takes care of them from homes and they are removed. The children's rights discourse, unlike the adult discourse, is going through, in my opinion, some lack of binding judicial enforcement. That mechanism doesn't exist. I mean, if you look at the staggering number of children that have been removed from Ukraine, you will agree with me that there is need for some kind of special tribunal on this issue. When it happened in Rwanda, the genocide, there was a special tribunal. Right. So, but now that we have this number of children that are actually counted by international organizations, we know, but we don't have a tribunal that really reinforces or makes very strong comments on this. And that for me is a starting point, something that we need to take very seriously. Because that is, in simple terms, the future of Ukraine that is being eroded or moved completely. You can kill a country with bombs and everything. You can also kill a country by stealing its future. And for me, removing children is part of that. It's part of that mechanism. The next thing that I also want just to run through is the fact that when you think a little bit deeply and you look at the vulnerability of children in these conversations, you could almost imagine the pain that they are going through. And what she missed now, because we've been on this panel discussing a lot of these things, is the distance that these children have to cover when they were taken back from Russia to be reintegrated into Ukraine. They almost went halfway round. So for me, I still think, and I think this is a conversation that we can also take either within the African Union position, which is something that we deal with a lot of children's rights issues, or at the United Nations level, to ensure that when it comes to children, there should be some special mechanisms that responds to these children's issues. Besides Myanmar, South Africa, Palestine, or Israel, sorry. South Africa, Israel, special measures had nothing to do with children, but children were killed there. Russia, Ukraine, they don't speak about children. When the ICC did its thing, or the UN, also nothing about children, or not a very strong statements about children, but we had children were removed in that country. So the complete, or the silence on children's issues is becoming too loud for us not to pay attention to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, guys, for everything. I think that I've just got a few points, because I must give some remarks, I suppose, being the HOD. And I think that I must just talk to these policy briefs, I think, and what they say, one, and two, what the way forward is. And when I read them through, and as I sort of got to know more about the war and the issues and this, even though I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, so I do have a bit of a disadvantage in that. The more I sort of begin to realize that a lot that is in here is the politics of naming and how we tell this story, right? And from what I read and see is that often the word war is used, and conflict is used, and invasion is used. But the issues that come out of here for me are more about military occupation and people who live under occupation on the one hand, and those who resist occupation and demand for self-determination. I think that for me is what sort of comes out more than the classic words war, invasions, that presumes that we can think of some kind of parity. And then I sort of get to think of, well, then why is it that the government here takes a certain position on the Palestinian question that is very clear and very coherent and, rigorous. But then when faced with this case, there's a bit of a dilly-dally, right? Let's be in the middle, let's mediate, etc. And I think that a lot of it maybe has to do with how we name things and what we call things. and the general narrative around them. And so I think that what I've been sort of left with here are a lot more questions than answers about how to think through these things. But maybe one kind of step forward is if we perhaps rethink, or maybe think about rethinking how we name this, and that it is in fact a military occupation, and what we're talking about here are all those issues related to it, be it problems of annexation, problems of nuclear safety, problems of children, etc. But it all, in many ways, is manifestations of the same thing. And I hope that with that confusing question that is unresolved, that we not make this a once-off affair, that we not leave the discussion here, and then this becomes the first of many joint collaborations and joint conversations. And I think that we are certainly more than happy to continue this, whether we do it from online, whether we have, whether we go there or whether you come back here again. But I think that it's something that does need the kind of urgency, I think, that we perhaps sometimes do not think it is as it is. And with that, I think that I'd like to thank everybody, thank our guests from Ukraine. You've come all the way here, and I think that we need to give you like a good send-off, I think. And thanks for all the people who have come to try to take part in this. Oh, sorry, the guest from Pretoria. I think that is the first time I've met you, and I think that this should be the first amongst many. And I think that let's all just. I think that Maxim summed it up about we just got to learn more about each other more, I think. And that I am,
Thanks. And also, if anyone has suggestions on what could be the additional inputs into the document, please get in touch with us. The case studies are available, and also, if you would like presentations of the speakers, they're also available. Thanks a lot for attending today, and thanks Vlatu to hosting and to UCT Political Department. Thank you.
Sorry, about the South African role, was there any at all?